This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for September 16th, 2020, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
Christina Roach.
Hey, everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi, guys.
We have a great show for you today. Christina is going to look into whether David Bowie purposely duped the art world. I'm going to give you some book reviews, evolution, Oculus, and Google. But first, Adam, is there life on Venus?
Maybe. Thanks for listening.
Great website. What?
It's complicated.
It's complicated. It's complicated there. You may have heard the news. There may be life on Venus. This is a departure from the usual speculation of whether or not there may be life on Mars, or 2020's fun new question, whether or not there will be life on Earth for very long. So what's going on here? Now, the big to-do is about a chemical called phosphine. Now, it's a gas with the chemical formula pH3. The chemical was detected in amounts around 20 parts per billion in the middle atmosphere of the planet Venus. Okay, well, we think it's phosphine, but that itself is hard to determine without a doubt. There was absorption of light detected with a wavelength of about a millimeter, and the only known explanation for this is phosphine. No other atom or molecule is known to absorb this specific wavelength. This idea of, we can't explain it any other way, so it's probably this thing, will be a recurring theme in this segment.
Aliens.
So saying that this is phosphine isn't outside of the realm of plausibility. That seems to be a decent conclusion based on the observations of two different telescopes. So let's say it's phosphine, because if we don't, we're not really going anywhere. The origin of this chemical does not have a known explanation. And so, I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens.
Great minds think alike.
Indeed. So there was a study by MIT, University of Cambridge, Cardiff University, and the University of Manchester, which looked at the conventional processes which could explain this formation of phosphine and found none. So phosphine can occur naturally. Some is found on Jupiter and Saturn, for example, but this takes enormous amounts of energy like that found in the storms of Jupiter, right? High pressure, high volatility, all sorts of stuff going on. No abiotic explanation, meaning one which does not derive from biological life, can currently explain why it is there on Venus. That means it's aliens, right? More specifically, the idea here would be that some sort of microbes would exist in the Venusian atmosphere. So it's expected that nothing resembling life on Earth could exist on the hot, inhospitable surface of Venus, where temperatures on the surface are at least 462 degrees Celsius. That's 735 degrees Kelvin for our more scientifically minded friends.
And don't insult us by doing the math.
And the pressure is 1,300 pounds per square inch, about 90 times that here on Earth. So that's not promising. However, in the atmosphere, there are areas where the temperature is much more moderate and life as we know it could theoretically exist. On planets like Earth, phosphine is produced by living things. Here on Earth, it is exclusively produced by biological sources or made by humans artificially and therefore still the product of a life form. Humans can have some in their intestines. It can be found in animal feces. It's also found to be associated with anaerobic organisms, meaning they aren't in the presence of free oxygen. Worth noting that we don't actually know how Earth microbes make it. Well, that's fine. We also don't know how it's made on Venus. Now, I don't think we need to bring up aliens for the explanation for how Earth microbes make it, though that seems to be the thing to do right now. Even though we have confirmed organisms here which create phosphine, the levels in Earth's atmosphere are thousands of times lower than what's found on Venus. Let's consider also that at the height of the atmosphere where the phosphine was detected, it would decompose fairly rapidly, so it likely hasn't been around and just staying there for thousands of years. If it had been, it would have leached away, decomposed. How plausible is this whole idea? Well, we can speculate about the frequency of life developing on a planet, but as we currently have exactly one confirmed planet we know of where life originated, this one is a hard guess. We can, however, consider whether the conditions for life to originate do exist. It does seem possible that some sort of simple life form could have originated and later evolved in the upper atmosphere of Venus. Alternatively, Venus may have been more hospitable to life as we know it in the past. There was likely water on the surface before a greenhouse effect similar to that causing anthropogenic global warming caused the surface temperature to increase considerably. So by this logic, there could have been life on the surface, and some of that may have made its way into the atmosphere. This is plausible as life on Earth has done this, as some microorganisms can similarly be found in Earth's atmosphere. This makes me think of the Sherlock Holmes quote by the author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. When you have eliminated all which is impossible, then whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Now, I never liked this quote because
This reminds me of this quote I hate. I wonder if people remember the quotes they hate more than ones they like.
I remember both. So I don't really like this quote because people can usually not be sure they've really eliminated all possible explanations. It is commonly used to support paranormal explanations for things when they've discounted more mundane explanations. There's actually a logical fallacy for this called the Holmesian Fallacy. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was conned into believing in fairies, and he believed in ghosts, so he's not exactly a spokesman for the rational, even if his character was quite intelligent. You can do that with writing.
Oh, snap.
It can also be considered a type of anomaly hunting. So we found something which we can't explain, so the explanation which we prefer seems to fit, because we want it to be aliens. Now, I don't want to be overly critical here. This isn't some crackpot idea. This is real science being done by real scientists. I think searching for extraterrestrial life is an important goal, and this kind of research is exactly the kind of thing one would need to do in order to find such a thing. We have a product which in this setting can only be explained by biological life, and so this suggests that that may be the explanation. There may be some other non-alien, much more mundane, but still currently unknown explanation for this phenomenon. Just some chemical process which is occurring on Venus which could explain this. And the researchers, themselves being serious scientists, are not ruling such an explanation out, but they did attempt to find any mundane explanation. They couldn't find one. Now, Mars has gotten a lot of attention, and this particular phenomenon is being suggested as a reason to give Venus a closer look. I've seen articles asking if we are so interested in Mars, why not Venus? Now, this is a valid question, and certainly there may be very interesting things on Venus. Time and money are going to be a constraint of where effort can be placed. You can't similarly research both planets. In this case, I think there is one practical reason for which Mars can be more interesting to us. Regardless of whether life could exist on or around Mars or Venus, humans are much more likely to be able to set foot on the surface of Mars than on Venus anytime soon. So maybe this is one reason for which humans are naturally inclined to be more interested in Mars. Now, I don't have an answer for this one. Life on Venus can explain this. Something else may explain it, but since a bunch of really smart researchers don't know what it is, I certainly wouldn't try to guess myself. This doesn't mean the explanation doesn't exist. In conclusion, I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens.
Now, Adam, you said there's maybe many reasons why Mars had more attention than Venus.
Yeah.
But given that men are from Mars and women are from Venus, don't you think it's just misogyny?
Yes, but as a man, don't we want to go check out Venus? Am I right,
Oh,
guys?
touche. Counterpoint, yes. To my very intelligent point.
So I've read a fair amount about this, and people are cautiously optimistic about it, which I think is the right approach, which is exactly what your segment was about. Even Stuart Robbins was posting about this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of an enthusiast about aliens, and I like to think of myself as an optimist about the possibility of alien life, and I think it makes plausible sense, and I feel like they could be out there, but still, when I hear about news about it, I'd be like, okay, we really gotta be careful and make sure like that's really the only possibility. So, I would love if they would put more, shine more light on it and go check it out and things like that. But I know that, like I said, time and money is not infinite. So, we'll see if that becomes a priority, and we'll see if this, if this research makes that seem more alluring to various scientists.
I like the way you say, go check it out. Like, get in the car and just go check it out.
I'm just going to shine a light on it. I'll use a flashlight.
Yeah.
I think you also raised a great point, Adam, about whether people have ruled out all things which may be possible. Mm-hmm. And usually it's a failure of imagination, right? It's like either our current understanding or just that individual's current understanding. And it's like, well, what's more plausible? Is it actually aliens? Or maybe you just didn't think of something because you couldn't think of anything. And so personal limitation of imagination sometimes becomes a justified explanation for why things may happen. And that's just ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, in this case, there was certainly, there's sort of a body of scientists that kind of went together to try to find a plausible explanation, and they didn't have it. So maybe it's not that one person can't think of it, but maybe sort of the body of scientific knowledge cannot explain it by any other way. But that still doesn't mean it's aliens, right?
That's true. So, Christina, if Bowie was playing on Venus, do you think he'd feel under pressure?
Nice.
And did he purposely dupe the art world?
Yep, it's a spoiler right off the top. David Bowie masterminded one of the biggest art hoaxes in history. For those of you who didn't know, well, surprise. I'm going to tell you the story. It's actually pretty fun. Now, this was news to me as well until recently, and I've been a longtime fan of Bowie's. Biggest art hoax may sound like a stretch, right? But this was a seriously elaborate scheme. Notable people in the worlds of art, literature, and the media were totally duped. The hoax culminated with a very shishi launch party on April Fool's Day in 1998, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Here is the backstory. Bowie was a well-known art lover. He befriended an award-winning novelist named William Boyd, who famously wrote Any Human Heart when they were on the board of directors for Modern Painter magazine. They completely hit it off and were both sort of kindred spirits. They absolutely loved art, but as a rock star and a novelist, they kind of floated outside of the snobby art world bubble, so to speak. Now, Floyd said in The Guardian, Bowie's life as an editor, art critic, and writer for modern painters, artist, collector, publisher, and hoaxer has inevitably taken second place to his astonishing renown and achievement as musician and global cultural icon. But it was very important to him, I believe, and he relished the fact that his occupancy of these other roles had little to do with his global fame and star power. So Boyd and Bowie came up with a wild scheme to concoct a fictitious lost American artist named Nat Tate. They'd slip the feature into the magazine and see if they could fool people. Now, according to Floyd, he had suggested the idea of creating the fictional artist, but it was Bowie who took it to the next level. Bowie was pretty confident that the concept would work better if it were published as a book. They were both pretty sure they would fool everyone. So they created this really detailed backstory. Nat Tate was born an orphan in 1928 in New Jersey. He was adopted, went to art school, and set up shop in Greenwich Village in New York City in the 50s. He met Picasso and Braque in France, but instead of being inspired, he felt so subpar, he burned most of his oeuvre, as in his paintings. Plagued with substance abuse and depression, Tate sadly committed suicide at age 31 from a death leap. This elaborate story worked because it was hard to corroborate, right? Tate burned most of his work. They never found his body. But Bowie and Boyd knew they had to create some tangible evidence in order to really get away with this. It is visual art after all. They got a publisher in Germany to put out a book which actually Bowie and Boyd created. Boyd wrote the details about Tate's life. They included legit-looking footnotes and historical photos using people captioned as Tate. I feel like I'm giving people a guide as to how to make a fake bio right now. The icing on the cake, Boyd could paint. So he created some pieces of art to include, and he credited them to the so-called lost artist. They got some notable people in on the joke to write quotes for the book, like Picasso's biographer, John Richardson, and famed American writer Gore Vidal. When I say elaborate, I wasn't kidding. Even Bowie included his own quote about Tate. Here it is. The great sadness of this quiet and moving monograph is that the artist's most profound dread that God will make you an artist but only a mediocre artist did not in retrospect apply to Nat Tate. Okay, fast forward to the party, April Fool's Day, 98. This was the launch of their fake book titled Nat Tate, an American Artist, 1928 to 1960. Notably, the first on Bowie's publishing house, 21. They spared no details here. The party was at Jeff Koons' studio, a really popular pop culture artist who apparently was not in on the joke. The who's who of the art scene showed up, presumably because FOMO. Bowie and a journalist named David Lister read excerpts from the book to guests and started discussions with the clear assumption that the guests obviously knew who they were talking about.
That's rude.
Oh, yeah. It gets better. Some of the guests even claimed to remember going to Tate's art exhibits in the 50s.
Oh, boy.
Wow.
The event was so successful, they planned a launch party in London, but Lister broke the story in The Independent, it's a newspaper in the UK. He talks about how people in the art world were afraid to just be honest and say they'd never heard of this guy Tate. Here's a fun quote. The critics, artists, and gallery owners who have been taken in by one of the best literary scams in years must be wishing they could disappear as effectively as Nat Tate and, like him, resurface with their reputations dramatically enhanced. I love this. It reminds me of those Jimmy Kimmel Lycam bits where they make up fake band names and they stop Coachella concert goers to see if they'll lie about knowing the artist. Have you guys ever seen one of those segments?
I've not, but that is
you
so
get the
believable.
gist, Adam.
Yeah.
It's basically
Oh,
they're
yeah.
like, so you must obviously be looking forward to seeing the Jewelry Thief tonight or whatever band name. And the person inevitably is always like, oh yeah, they're my favorite. Whatever. It's just pretty funny.
Yeah.
Oh, human nature. It does kind of suck, though, that Lister broke the story so fast because Bowie was actually hoping to draw it all out and even try to get Tate's remaining work, quote unquote work, in a major museum, then blow the whistle on the art world, which is still genius, but damn, we didn't get there.
I guess ethically it would have been dubious if he started doing things like selling pieces, right?
For sure.
Yeah, for sure. So, to your point, could they get in trouble for this? Technically, there was no crime. So, no one was asked for money. They were just giddy that they could pull off a practical joke of this magnitude. Everybody just took the word of the cool rock star, didn't really verify any of the publications in the footnotes or checked referenced evidence or even the photos. And yeah, they didn't ask for money, but this did propel Boyd's popularity. And he went on talk shows. And even though they didn't set out to make any money from the so-called Tate art, a quote, rare surviving drawing from Tate's bridge series, bridge number 114, was sold at auction at Sotheby's London in 2011 for over £7,000, which went to charity.
Okay, wow.
Now, William Boyd published a very touching rendition of this story in The Guardian after David Bowie died, which I link to in the show notes per usual. There you go.
Banksy before there was Banksy.
Yeah.
And since that day, there's no more superficiality in the art world.
I feel like this is this couldn't have happened much later than it did. Like 1998 is kind of early internet, kind of pre-Wikipedia and stuff. But like if you tried to do that today, how come this guy doesn't have a Wikipedia page? Or if he does have a Wikipedia page, why was it made by David Bowie 4 days ago or something like that, right? You could figure it out pretty quickly. Or, you're doing reverse image searches on some of these pictures. But it sounds like the people didn't even suspect enough to need to try to do that sort of research. But
What are you making those faces over there, Roach?
Because I'm thinking about Mr. Brainwash.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, people don't actually care, to Pat's point.
Yeah.
It's to look important, to feel important. And even if it was revealed this was a hoax, we know that some of the stuff that's sold might even be worth more. Right? Because people don't...
Good
It's
point.
just having social status signaling, cultural cachet. And yes, you're the dupe, but then you own a part of it, and it's all humans in some other way.
Yeah. Yeah, the dupe itself is the story now, which is fun. And like to have one of those books from 98 would be cool. Right? Even when it's fake. It's like, okay, well, this itself has a story, right?
With an original piece of art, a fake art.
Oh, man. How dumb would you feel, though, if you had looked David Bowie in the eye and said, I was at one of Tate's art exhibits in the 50s. It was smashing. And and he knows you're full of it.
Thanks, Christina. And now I'm going to give you some book reviews because I've been reading a lot these past few months. Touching on evolution is one of them, Oculus is another, and then life after Google is yet another. I'll do a bit of a summary, but also try to extract interesting bits, perhaps even for discussion.
Just some light reading for Darren this summer, apparently.
Yeah. So the first is called From Darwin to Derrida, subtitle Selfish Genes, Social Selves, and the Meanings of Life by David Haig. And I would say this brief review is neither hagiography nor fully hagiological. And if you found that previous sentence appealing, and you like molecular biology, you might like this book. And for the rest of you who said I didn't, exactly. Evolutionary biologist David Haig is a very smart man and has written an ambitious book. He deserves credit for exploring and explaining, with some advocacy, how scientists are talking past each other. For example, gene selectionists versus multi-level selectionists. This would be your Dawkins versus your Sloan Wilson for those who care about such things, as well as how those in sciences and humanities often talk past each other. I really appreciate this because I often try to do this when I'm having discussions or observing discussions with other people. What is the main crux of our disagreement? How might we be talking past each other? He advocates for meaning to be the physical output of an interpretive process, and a process that could occur on the level of genes or molecular biology or higher order human conversations and everything in between. The book has many interesting parts about genetics, intrapersonal conflict, and issues of meaning. He even talks about how genes from your mother might behave differently than genes from your father, depending on where they came from, depending on the situation, about who's going to be replicated to whom across your siblings and whatnot. And I thought about conflict within a parent. Like I know the fetus and the mother, they battle for resources while the mother's pregnant, but I hadn't quite thought about maternal and paternal genes also battling in slightly different ways. Haig is capable of writing clearly, playfully, and with great depth. Unfortunately, not always, and the writing is not consistently accessible. The reader gets a short, concise sentence just before a dense fog of molecular biology appears.
Oh.
Yeah. This was a rough book. At times, Haig seems to recognize that although the readers won't have an undergraduate degree in molecular biology, but more often than not, it seems such a foundation is necessary not only to get the general issue at hand, but to serve as a launching pad for a deeper or meta discussion of differences and complications. Right? Because like, let me try to clear up these things. You're like, what were the things in the first place? I don't understand what we're talking about. Now, MIT Press provided the following description. In From Darwin to Derrida, evolutionary biologist David Haig explains how a physical world of matter and motion gave rise to a living world of purpose and meaning. Natural selection, a process without purpose, give rise to purposeful beings who find meaning in the world. End quote. I don't think he really did that. Or rather, I already had that belief due to Dennett's great book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And I think it's unlikely that the average reader would come away convinced of the thesis if they only read Haig's book. Dennett loved this book. He did the foreword, and Haig cites some of Dennett's stuff. Why not just read the Darwin's Dangerous Idea instead? Now, to be fair, that's not an easy read, but that's even easier than the Haig book, in my opinion. Perhaps the most useful part of the book was how it humbles. It highlighted I wasn't entirely sure what a gene was, which I knew, to be fair. But now I'm also not entirely sure what a phenotype is, or even an environment is, or even notions of cause.
Wow.
And he's like, well, a phenotype only makes sense when you compare it to what's possible. And you're like, uh-huh. And then you get the next sentence, you're like, what now? Huh? And then it builds after chapter. It's a somewhat disconnected chapter. So while I would learn things in the process of reading, I also had an aversion to begin reading in the first place because of the dense and uneven nature of the text and the uncertainty of the reward. Like, I did not look forward to reading this. Wow. As such, I can't recommend this book to many, admitting some of the content was over my head. But I would recommend checking out some of his key writings, especially on the contrast between the informational gene and the material gene, or strategic gene. This book is a sort of an exploration in evolutionary biology, but also a bit of the philosophy of biology. Yeah. So the idea is that the material gene is the physical gene that you might think about in your strand of DNA that's being replicated, that's moving around. Then he's trying to talk about a higher level pattern of the gene, the informational gene that's occurring over the history of, say, life, and whether that gene has moved or not. So there are interesting ideas in here. They're not that easy to understand. It is useful when someone highlights the complications and problems that occur in evolutionary thinking. Precisely that when we go to understand anything as science people, you want something to be fixed to understand what it is. You can describe it, you can see how it interacts with the world. But by definition, evolution changes things over time. So you have a fixed thing, which is changing to something else. Well, what's fixed then? Well, it is fixed and it isn't fixed. Anyway, this is just a hint of it all. All I have to say is it was complicated. It was difficult. I think most people probably would not enjoy this, but evolution is still a great topic. So read up on that as you wish. 2 more quick reviews. The first is a book called The History of the Future, Oculus, Facebook, and the Revolution That Swept Virtual Reality. Now, the history of the future, like Oculus, isn't that just like 5-6 years old? So yes, this is a recent history. This is much easier than the Hague book. It's a decently captivating narrative of the history and development of Oculus virtual reality. It focuses on people and relationships more than the technology. Oh, you get a bit of that. And the book shows the ins and outs of trying to bring a complicated product to market and sort of a startup to maturity or acquisition. For those who are not aware, Oculus was a combination of several different people, largely this guy, Lucky Palmer, who was working out of a trailer making VR gear, and he met some VC guys, and they started this company, and they were able to put stuff together, and they brought in some expertise, and a few years later, Facebook, paid like $2 to $4 billion.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting and engaging. Although I would have liked more a bit on the implications of virtual reality. It really is, this is like a nice story to listen to. I also was an audio, which makes it even more interesting as a story. Finally, it's hard to know how legitimate the framing of certain events are at the end of the book, with the key founder being pushed out of his own company. But this was an interesting reminder that most media don't report the real story of what's happening and complexities abound. Let me explain. So Palmer Luckey is I think he was 20 at the time. He's 27 now. He was the co-founder and creator of a lot of this stuff. Like, he didn't have all the expertise. They brought in other people and he wasn't the CEO. He was a Trump supporter. He never talked about it. And through some sort of online messaging system, he ended up donating $10,000 anonymously to a Trump-backed online listserv, something like this. But that listserv would sometimes get all these other Trump supporters, some of whom were white supremacists, posting stuff. Now, the people who ran that said, this is no place here. This is not the place for it. We don't want anything to do with white supremacy. That's not what we stand for. Get out. Don't be here. Yep. But eventually it was somehow leaked, because a reporter actually betrayed him, that he was the person behind this. Yeah. And then that seemed to have started a cascade where it was just unacceptable that this man had this position, because he was linked to, this guy supports white supremacy, not just this guy's a Trump supporter. So people are pulling back. And even though some of them said like, well, we have actually found no evidence he said anything bad ever. Yeah. So we're going to come back to the company. But it didn't look good. The book kind of makes the case that it's because of the political affiliation. Certainly it implies Facebook made him read a statement, which also implied he couldn't just be a Trump supporter. Yeah. And so that's why I said it's hard to know exactly what's going on here, but there's all these things that always happen behind the scenes, and you get a glimpse of at least one side of how this might have happened. Mm-hmm. Now, he's 27. I think he currently has about $700 million. Wow. Clearly it didn't work out that badly for him.
No kidding.
But if you trust the book, he said, I actually don't even want any of the money. I just want to stay and work in my company. Wow. Like, he loved VR. He cared about it. It was like his baby. He wants VR to succeed in the world so much so that he was worried about even how a false start wouldn't like negatively impact his company, but would impact VR itself. Because it has had false starts, right? We start thinking like, oh, right, that Nintendo VR, that red thing. I remember that, which went nowhere. And the other thing that went nowhere. Right, exactly. And of course now it seems like it's probably here to stay and only going to get better.
Well, VR is this odd thing that, you're right with the false starts. Like, I feel like people have talking about VR being the next thing since like the 80s and probably before that. Just as long as I can remember since I was a child, it always seemed like it was like 2 to 5 years away.
Like everything.
And it still kind of does.
Well, it's interesting. So we had AR, augmented reality, in Google Glass a bit. Yeah. And society wasn't quite ready for it, right? Yeah. You can see people wanting it soon, but we kind of gave it to them. They didn't want it for various reasons. And now give it another 5 years, right?
Yeah, it's like it's in Pokemon Go, but people don't do much with it. Right. I turn it off. Like, it's annoying.
Okay. And finally, a very short review of a book called Life After Google, The Fall of Big Data and the Rise of the Blockchain Economy. So here, this is by George Gilder. It seems a smart and knowledgeable man wrote a not so great book. Gilder is well respected. He's written numerous books about technology and economics, and he even anticipated the shift away from personal computers to portable devices in the 90s. And people are like, he's wrong. You're like, give it time. Oh yeah. All right. That's what we all do now. Yeah. So although Life After Google is filled with lots of information and observations, I mean, he's a smart guy. It's several hundred pages. It doesn't cohere, and it ends up unfocused and unconvincing. He seems to just dislike what Google does and then complains about it and sort of makes arguments, but really just doesn't like it. And he singles out Google as opposed to all the other, you have your Facebook, your Amazon, everything else. It doesn't really seem to make that much sense. For example, he seems to argue or heavily imply that only knowledge has value, like at some, I don't know, almost philosophical level. Yeah. And Google is cheating because it provides things for free. Like, even though he does say, of course, you're the product and advertising and this and that, but because you're giving it for free, it doesn't really count. You're like, but this is just what people want. It's just a different business model.
Because Google's not creating knowledge, but aggregating it? Is that kind of the argument?
I did not find his arguments convincing.
Yeah.
He didn't even say like, wow, people have decided the business model is, yeah, I'll give you my time, attention, and psychological space if you give me something for free. And that's how things are now. And I guess he's sort of like, well, they don't build something. And like, people really like using Google, finding out information, and also where to drive to. Like, it doesn't really make sense to me at all.
Sure.
He also didn't really explain that much about why exactly the blockchain will end Google's dominance. I mean, he talks a bit about it. Of course, he talks about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and all these sorts of things. But why? And also, wouldn't Google just invest in this if it's also useful? Like, these companies have billions. So it just didn't really work.
Well, and they seem wildly unrelated, right?
Yeah, I think it was that people won't tolerate the free service for advertising. And if you can make transactions anonymous and in a trusted way, you might not have to trust Google anymore. It really wasn't that clear. Mm-hmm. So, there's in the show notes, I linked to a much longer and almost more saddening review from someone who really likes the author, and even he was disappointed by this. So I think that's biased in the right direction. Anyway, I would say pass on this one and check out the link in the show notes at trcpodcast.com.
That's a great website. So Darren, the last two, it sounded like you didn't love, but they were okay. The first one, it sounded like it was a slog to get through. I wonder, do you ever just stop reading a book that you're not enjoying?
Well, okay, yes. So for some context, From Darwin to Derrida, the one that was a slog, was for my book group, and I had a hand in choosing it. And so I felt a moral obligation to finish it, which even one of the book group members said, like, oh, good, at least you finished because you picked it, you better, right? But everyone else, like 25%, 40%, 30%, most of them did not finish. Wow. Everyone thought it was difficult, so it's not just me. And a lot of these people have PhDs, just to give you nothing about that. But, this was not fun, light reading. Yeah. That said, a lot of it is very interesting and has a lot of interesting ideas for people interested in this stuff. The Oculus one really was a great story. Like, I found it quite captivating. It just wasn't as technical as I wanted it to be. So that is certainly the most accessible, most interesting one. It's a story, especially in audio. You're like, oh, here's a 17-hour story, which didn't take that long to go through. Now, I did to speed up the play rate, but I mean, even then, it wasn't effortful at all. And the last one was a bit of just me trying to be more aware of this stuff for understanding future trends.
Sure.
So that was a bit more work. But yes, you're right, Pat. I do sometimes stop reading a book. In this case, there were reasons to keep going for all of them.
Understood. I know that when I was in a book club, one time I recommended that we read Motley Crue's The Dirt. And of course, I had to get all the way through it because it was my recommendation.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us once again, listeners. Today we learned that David Bowie is on Venus and he cares about evolutionary theory. Until next time, think better, tack better.
Peace out, cuboids.
Stay classy, not smartassy.
We'll talk to you soon, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Oh, thanks.
I feel really lucky that I'm going to get to listen to this twice.
It's going to be the same kind of pain you'll be in when you're editing the show.
Ba-dum-ching. Wow. Christina just did a ba-dum-ching.
We've been recording for 7.5 minutes, and I have a minute of material.
And now me.
Talking about books
and
that
now, Darren.
Yeah, so go. You do it.
I read
segue.
books. Let me tell you about them.